Jake Morrison sat alone, a figure etched against the dim glow of the Blue Moon Cantina. His drink had long since lost its chill, yet he paid it no mind. The whispers of diverse alien species filled the air, their gazes fixed on him, a mixture of trepidation and something deeper, perhaps awe or terror. This establishment, nestled on the intergalactic trade hub Nexus Prime, was meant as neutral territory, a haven for peaceful coexistence. But peace, like many things, had been redefined. 2 decades had passed since the Great Conflict, yet the galaxy had not forgotten. They remembered what humanity was capable of when pushed to its limits. A young woman approached his table, her movements cautious, like someone nearing a slumbering beast. Her Galactic News Network press badge identified her as Lisa Kane, a human like him, though far too young to recall the war's horrors firsthand. "Commander Morrison," she began, her voice steady despite an undercurrent of apprehension. "I'm Lisa Kane. I reached out about an interview." Jake's eyes met hers. She was perhaps 25, born after the war's inception. She hadn't witnessed the transformation of humanity, hadn't heard the cries that still haunted his nights. "Take a seat," he rumbled, his voice roughened by years of command and recycled warship air. "You seek knowledge of the conflict? Of why they regard us thus?" He gestured towards the hushed alien patrons. Lisa settled into the chair, activating her recording device. "Tales abound across the galaxy," she stated. "But most official records are sealed. They say it altered everything, cementing humanity's position as the most formidable species in known space." Jake let out a humorless laugh. "Formidable, indeed." He sipped his lukewarm beverage. "Before the war, the Zephyrians labeled us soft mammals, fragile pinklings. They presumed we'd be easily subdued." The reporter leaned closer. "Recount the initial encounter. How did it all unfold?" Jake's gaze drifted, lost in the currents of memory, revisiting scenes he'd tried to suppress. 22 years ago. I was merely a lieutenant, patrolling the fringes of human territory. Captain Ryan Walsh commanded the UES Discovery, a good man, fair and dedicated to peace. The cantina's ambient sounds faded as Jake spoke, his voice imbued with the ache of a story that still wounded. We had spent months exploring, searching for new worlds for humanity's rapid expansion. 3 colony vessels accompanied us: the New Hope, the Bright Future, and Tomorrow's Dream. 50,000 souls, families, children, all seeking a fresh start. Lisa's recorder hummed softly. The aliens nearby, though outwardly engaged in their own conversations, subtly tuned in. "Then we encountered them," Jake continued. "The Zephyrians. 7-foot-tall reptilians with technology centuries beyond our own. They had dominated 12 star systems for over a millennium. Warriors, they called themselves, bound by a strict honor code." Jake's grip tightened on his glass. Captain Walsh attempted peaceful overtures. He sent transmissions in every language our systems could translate. Mathematical sequences, images of Earth, musical compositions. He wished them to understand our peaceful intentions. The veteran paused, his eyes still fixed on the internal playback of the past. The Zephyrian fleet commander introduced himself as Chronicle the Proud, conqueror of worlds, guardian of honor. Lisa waited, sensing the approaching crux of the narrative. "You know his response to Captain Walsh?" Jake's voice dropped, becoming edged with a quiet menace. He declared that soft mammals had no right to traverse the stars. That weak species should remain on their homeworlds, subservient to their betters. He offered us one chance to retreat and never return. Jake drained his glass. Captain Walsh attempted to negotiate, explaining our quest for uninhabited worlds, our lack of interest in conflict. But Crixt's mind was set. He proclaimed that humans needed to comprehend their place in the galactic order. The reporter's face was now pale, comprehension dawning. "They unleashed fire without a single word," Jake stated. "No warning, no declaration. They simply began firing. The Discovery's military-grade shields afforded us survival from the initial assault. But the colony ship," he shook his head. "Civilian craft. Unarmed, unarmored. 50,000 individuals yearning for a new home." Jake rose, moving to the cantina's expansive window. Beyond, the stars shimmered, cold and remote. "I witnessed those ships perish," he recounted. "Watched them fragment in the void. Saw the bodies of children drift past our viewports. The Zephyrians made no effort to rescue survivors. They merely continued firing until only debris remained." Lisa had ceased writing, her hands trembling slightly. Captain Walsh transmitted a message back to Earth. Jake continued. Just 4 words: they killed our children, then we fled. The discovery was swift, but not swift enough to engage an entire Zephyrian fleet. We barely made it home. Jake turned back to face the reporter, his eyes now cold like a winter landscape on a lifeless planet. 3 days later, Earth's reply arrived via subspace. It wasn't directed at Captain Walsh or me. It was broadcast on all frequencies aimed directly at Zephyrian space. The cantina had fallen into an absolute hush. Even the aliens had ceased their hushed conversations, listening. The message was straightforward, Jake revealed. A single sentence: you have made a grave mistake, and that was all. Yet those 5 words carried a greater menace than any formal declaration of war. Lisa finally found her voice. What transpired next? Jake smiled, and for the first time since their meeting it seemed genuine. Yet it was the smile of a predator recalling a successful hunt. Next, he said, the galaxy learned what humans do when their children are slaughtered. Next, Admiral Kate Sullivan received her orders from the Human Coalition. One directive: terminate the threat permanently. Jake returned to the table. Around them, the alien patrons began to disperse. They had heard enough. That, Jake concluded, is when the true war began. That's when the Zephyrians discovered why one should never attack something that retaliates. Lisa Kane stared across the table at Jake Morrison. The old soldier's face was impassive, his hands resting steadily on his empty glass. The cantina had grown even quieter, the few remaining aliens casting nervous glances their way. Tell me about the first strike, Lisa whispered, barely audible. Jake nodded slowly. 6 months after the colony ships were obliterated, Admiral Kate Sullivan marshaled the largest fleet in human history. 200 warships, every cannon, every missile, every fighter Earth could deploy. But the ships themselves weren't the most daunting aspect. He paused, remembering. The truly terrifying part was Lieutenant Colonel Alex Turner and his ground forces, the 7th Assault Division. 3,000 of the fiercest humans ever born. They had been honed for one purpose: combating aliens who underestimated humanity. Lisa leaned forward. What made them so different? Jake's eyes became distant once more. Other galactic species engage in conflict bound by honor codes and rules governing warfare. The Zephyrians had waged war for centuries, adhering to predictable patterns, vast fleets clashing in space, armies arrayed on planets, winners taking captives, losers surrendering with dignity. Jake shook his head. Humans don't fight that way. We forged our strategies in wars against ourselves, conflicts where survival outweighed any code of honor. The old soldier rose again, moving to the window. Outside, a Zephyrian merchant vessel docked at the station. Jake watched it, his gaze laced with an ancient animosity. The initial engagement took place on Zephyr 4, he recounted, a mining world inhabited by 2 million Zephyrian civilians. Their military anticipated a strike against their orbital defenses, standard procedure. Instead, Colonel Turner inserted his troops onto the planet's shadowed side. Lisa was now scribbling notes, determined to capture every word. The Zephyrians had never encountered asymmetric warfare, Jake continued. Turner's forces targeted supply lines, crippled communication networks, tainted water sources. They didn't directly assault the enemy army. They systematically dismantled everything that sustained it. Jake turned back to her. Dr. Michelle Barnes was embedded with Turner's forces. A xenobiologist, the most brilliant woman I've ever known, she had meticulously studied Zephyrian biology for months following first contact, identifying their vulnerabilities. A shiver ran down the reporter's spine. What kind of weaknesses? Illnesses, Jake stated simply. Terrestrial bacteria, harmless to humans, but profoundly debilitating to Zephyrians, he continued. Dr. Barnes introduced these pathogens into their food supplies, their water, and the atmospheric systems of their cities. Jake resumed his seat, his voice dispassionate as if discussing mundane weather. Within 2 weeks, half the planet's populace was too ill to fight. The other half was occupied caring for the sick. The Zephyrian military was forced to choose between engaging us and preserving their people. Lisa's pen had stilled. That's biological warfare. Yes, Jake affirmed. It is. And it proved effective. The cantina now felt colder. Even the background music seemed muted. The Zephyrian fleet commander transmitted a message to Colonel Turner. Jake proceeded. He demanded adherence to galactic rules of war, declaring that employing disease as a weapon was dishonorable, a violation of the codes observed by civilized species. Jake offered that same chilling smile. Turner's reply was a recording, just him standing before a mound of debris from one of our annihilated colony ships. He said, "You speak of honor. You murdered 50,000 of our children. We are merely returning the favor." Lisa felt a wave of nausea. "What became of the prisoners?" "What prisoners?" Jake countered. "The Zephyrians expected treatment according to galactic norms, clean cells, adequate provisions, medical attention, anticipation of exchange upon war's end." The old soldier's voice hardened. "But humans never agreed to abide by alien rules. Commander Ben Foster oversaw prisoner operations. He put captured Zephyrians to toil in the very mines they had constructed, making them repair the damage their own weapons had wrought, feeding them the same tainted rations they had consumed." Jake leaned back. By then the galaxy was watching. Other species began transmitting messages to both sides, attempting mediation, urging humans to conform to proper wartime procedures. Lisa looked up from her notes. "Did Earth respond?" "Admiral Sullivan sent one message to the Galactic Defense Council," Jake stated. "Short and to the point, we didn't initiate this conflict, but we will conclude it. Stay out of our way." The reporter could hear her own heartbeat in the ensuing silence. "That's when other species became truly alarmed," Jake continued. "The Andromedans withdrew their trade vessels from human space. The Centauri Collective canceled all diplomatic gatherings. Even the Pacific Aetherans began constructing defensive platforms along their borders." Jake gestured towards the aliens in the cantina. "Observe them. 2 decades later, and they still watch us as if we might erupt." That fear took root during the war's second month. Lisa followed his gaze. A group of Andromedans at a nearby table were whispering urgently, one of them repeatedly glancing at Jake with wide, nervous eyes. "The Zephyrians appealed for aid," Jake said. "They broadcast messages to every allied species. These humans are savages," they proclaimed. "They disregard the rules. They must be stopped before they endanger everyone." Jake's laugh was bitter, but no one came to their assistance. Other species began scrutinizing human military history, delving into our internecine conflicts. The more they discovered, the greater their fear. The old soldier finished his second drink. Dr. Frank Lee, a member of a human diplomatic team at the time, reported that alien governments were holding emergency sessions, not to halt the war, but to determine their course of action if humans triumphed. Lisa appeared bewildered. If humans won, weren't the Zephyrians stronger? On paper, yes, Jake conceded. Superior technology, more ships, a larger population. But they were fighting by rules we had never consented to follow. They expected honor. We delivered efficiency. Jake rose to depart. By the end of the second month, something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy. The Galactic Defense Council enacted the first human protocol, emergency procedures for dealing with human military forces. Lisa swiftly gathered her notes. What kind of procedures? Jake paused at the cantina door. Simple ones. If humans declare war on your species, evacuate all civilians immediately. Do not attempt negotiation. Do not anticipate mercy. Simply flee and hope they allow you to live. The old soldier looked back at her one last time. That protocol remains in effect today, 20 years later. Wish to know why? Lisa nodded, though unsure if she truly wanted the answer. Because the war was just beginning, Jake said, and the galaxy hadn't witnessed anything yet. He exited into the corridor, leaving Lisa alone with her notes and the frightened whispers of aliens who still remembered humanity's capabilities when their children perished. Lisa Kane found Jake Morrison the following day at the same table in the Blue Moon Cantina. He gazed out at the stars, a fresh drink in hand. The aliens in the establishment granted his table an even wider berth than before. Word of their conversation had clearly spread. You returned, Jake said without turning. I need to hear the rest, Lisa replied, settling across from him. What happened after the human protocol was established? Jake shifted his attention to her. His eyes seemed older today, as if recounting the war had aged him overnight. The true conflict began then. What preceded it was merely the prelude. He took a slow sip of his drink. General Amanda Cross assumed command of strategic planning 6 months into the hostilities. She convened a meeting of all human military commanders. I was there, serving as Admiral Sullivan's aide. Lisa activated her recording device. Around them, the cantina seemed to hold its breath. General Cross stood before a room filled with officers. Jake continued, and uttered 3 words that altered everything. Total war doctrine. That was when we ceased pretending this was a conventional conflict. The old soldier's voice dropped lower. She explained it plainly. We weren't merely fighting to defeat the Zephyrian military. We were fighting to ensure they could never again threaten humanity. Ever. Lisa felt the temperature in the room seemingly plummet. What did that entail? It meant Captain Steve Martin and his orbital bombardment fleet received new directives. Jake explained. Not just to strike military targets, but to strike everything. Factories, farms, schools, hospitals. If it sustained Zephyrian society, it was a target. Jake rose, beginning to pace by the window. The galaxy watched in horror as human vessels systematically devastated entire worlds, not merely conquering them, but rendering them incapable of supporting life. The reporter looked down at her notes, struggling to process what she was hearing. How could the military rationalize targeting civilians? Jake stopped pacing and regarded her with cold eyes. 50,000 dead children justify a great many things. General Cross articulated it simply. They initiated this conflict by slaughtering our innocents. We will conclude it by ensuring they can kill no more. He resumed his seat. Major Holly Stewart was then leading special operations. Her teams were unlike regular soldiers. They spoke Zephyrian languages, understood their culture, their fears. Lisa leaned forward. What was their function? Psychological warfare, Jake revealed. Stewart's personnel would infiltrate Zephyrian communication networks and broadcast recordings. The sounds of human children screaming as their colony ships perished. Messages from the deceased, questioning why the Zephyrians had taken their lives. The old soldier's voice grew distant. They also disseminated misinformation, convinced the Zephyrians their own government planned to surrender, made them believe their allies had abandoned them, weaponizing their own propaganda against them. Jake paused to finish his drink, but the most insidious aspect was what Major Stewart termed escalation psychology. Her teams meticulously studied Zephyrian military leaders, learning about their families, their fears, their vulnerabilities. Lisa's pen had stopped moving. She was apprehensive to inquire, but felt compelled. What did they do with that intelligence? They utilized it, Jake said simply. If a Zephyrian commander hesitated to engage human forces, Stewart's operatives would send him images of his family. Not direct threats precisely, merely pictures accompanied by messages like, "We know where they reside." The cantina was now completely silent. Even the ambient music had ceased. The Zephyrians mounted one final major offensive, Jake continued. Crix the Proud amassed every ship he could find, called in favors from allied species, constructing the largest war fleet in galactic history. Jake's eyes gleamed with a terrible memory. They attacked Kepler Station, our primary supply depot. They believed if they could sever our supply lines, they could compel us to negotiate. Lisa found her voice. What transpired? The Battle of Kepler Station, Jake declared. 3 days of combat that reshaped galactic understanding of warfare. Admiral Carl Hayes commanded our defense fleet. A capable man, but he operated under orders from General Cross. Jake rose again, this time walking to the cantina's bar. He ordered another drink, then continued speaking as the bartender poured. Hayes allowed the Zephyrian fleet to close in, he described. Permitted them to believe they were victorious. Then he activated weaponry never before seen in galactic conflict. The old soldier returned to the table with his fresh drink. Antimatter bombs. Quantum viruses capable of crippling entire computer networks. Weapons that not only eliminated enemy combatants but rendered their vessels uninhabitable for centuries. Lisa's face had gone pale. That's illegal under galactic law. What law? Jake countered. Humans never ratified those treaties. We never consented to restrict our armaments. Why should we fight with one hand tied behind our backs? He took a long drink. The Zephyrian fleet was annihilated in 6 hours. Not merely defeated, but utterly destroyed. Every ship reduced to radioactive debris. 40,000 Zephyrian warriors perished. Jake looked out the window again, but that wasn't the most disturbing part. Dr. Peter Blake was then working with refugee populations, studying the war's psychological impact on Zephyrian civilians. The reporter waited for him to continue. He discovered something the galaxy had never witnessed before, Jake recounted. An entire species developing trauma simply from engaging humans in conflict. Zephyrian civilians were tormented by nightmares of beings they had never seen. Children were terrified to sleep, haunted by dreams of human soldiers. Jake's voice softened, becoming more pensive. Dr. Blake termed it species-wide post-traumatic stress disorder. The mere concept of battling humans had become so terrifying it was fracturing their minds. Lisa looked up from her notes. How did the galactic community react? Panic, Jake said simply. The Galactic Defense Council convened emergency sessions daily. Other species began withdrawing their military forces from anywhere near human space. Trade ceased. Diplomacy halted. Everyone feared we might turn on them next. The old soldier finished his drink and prepared to depart. 3 weeks after Kepler Station, the Zephyrian Military Command transmitted a message to General Cross. Not a surrender. Not a negotiation. A plea. Lisa gathered her belongings swiftly, unwilling for him to leave before concluding the story. What did the message say? Jake paused at the cantina door. They implored us to stop, stated they would concede anything we desired. Territory, resources, technology. They simply wanted the killing to end. He looked back at her one last time. General Cross returned a single-word response. No. Jake stepped into the corridor, leaving Lisa alone with the profound weight of what she had heard. Around her, the alien patrons finished their drinks and left quickly. None wished to remain in the same room where human warfare had been so candidly discussed. The young reporter sat alone, staring at her notes, wondering how much more terrible the story could become. Tomorrow she would learn of the war's final phase, the part that made the galaxy whisper humanity's name in terror, even 2 decades later. 3 days later, Lisa Kane waited at the same table in the Blue Moon Cantina. Jake Morrison was late and she began to worry he wouldn't come. The story he was unfolding grew darker with each segment, and she could see its toll on the old soldier. When Jake finally arrived, he looked weary, more so than before. He sat down without ordering a drink, staring at the table for a long moment. This segment is the most difficult to relate, he said quietly. This is the part that instilled eternal fear of us throughout the galaxy. Lisa activated her recording device. The cantina was almost deserted today. Word of their conversations had spread, and most aliens were actively avoiding the establishment. After the Zephyrians pleaded for mercy, Jake began. General Cross convened another meeting, but this time it wasn't just military commanders. Politicians from Earth were present too. Scientists, historians. They were orchestrating something far grander than anyone had envisioned. Jake finally looked up at Lisa, his eyes holding a sadness she hadn't observed before. Colonel Nancy Price was placed in charge of occupation forces. She was a logistics expert, skilled at organization, at making systems operate efficiently. The old soldier paused, collecting his thoughts. Price's objective wasn't merely to defeat the remaining Zephyrian forces. Her mission was to guarantee the Zephyrian species could never again threaten humanity. Ever. Lisa felt a chill trace down her spine. What exactly did that signify? It meant Lieutenant Sam Davis and his technical teams were dispatched to every Zephyrian world, Jake explained. Their orders were straightforward. Locate every piece of military technology, every weapons factory, every research facility. Not to capture them, but to fully comprehend them. Jake rose, walking to the window. Outside, a Zephyrian merchant argued with station security over docking fees, the alien's voice high and nervous even over such a minor dispute. Davis and his people didn't merely confiscate Zephyrian technology, Jake continued. They reverse-engineered everything, deciphered its workings. Then they developed countermeasures. Weapons specifically designed to disable Zephyrian ships. Viruses that could cripple Zephyrian computer networks. Biological agents that exclusively impacted Zephyrian physiology. The reporter was writing furiously, attempting to capture every word. Why such extreme measures? Jake turned back to face her. Because humans possess foresight. We learned from our own history that defeating an enemy once is insufficient. They might rebuild. They might return stronger. The only path to absolute safety is to ensure they can never again pose a threat. He resumed his seat, his voice becoming more detached, clinical. But technology was merely the starting point. Colonel Price implemented what she called bloodline tracking. Every Zephyrian family was cataloged, their genetic profiles recorded, their locations monitored. Lisa looked up from her notes. They tracked entire families for generations. Precisely, Jake confirmed. The computer systems Colonel Price developed could predict which Zephyrian children might mature into military leaders, which possessed genetic markers for aggression, which might someday harbor desires for vengeance against humanity. The old soldier's voice was now flat, devoid of emotion. Those children were marked, not eliminated, merely observed perpetually. If any ever displayed signs of organizing resistance, human agents would visit their families. Lisa's pen had stopped moving. What sort of visits? Quiet ones, Jake answered. Dr. Frank Lee documented the process. Human agents would simply materialize at a Zephyrian residence. They wouldn't issue threats. They would merely stand there for a few minutes, then depart. The message was unambiguous. We know who you are, where you reside, and what you're contemplating. Jake ordered a drink from a passing server. When it arrived, he stared into it without drinking. But the most terrifying aspect was what Lieutenant Davis termed dead man switches. He continued. Systems hidden throughout former Zephyrian space. Weapon platforms, computer viruses, biological agents, all dormant, waiting. Lisa found her voice. Waiting for what? Waiting for any indication that Zephyrians were reconstituting their military, Jake explained. The systems were engineered to activate automatically if they detected specific patterns. Too many ships congregating in one location. Excessive metal refinement. Too many young Zephyrians uniting. The old soldier finally took a sip of his drink. If those systems ever activated, they would sterilize entire worlds. Not merely destroy military targets, but eradicate everything. Plants, animals, bacteria. Transform living worlds into inert rocks adrift in space. The cantina felt colder now. Even the few remaining alien patrons whispered more softly. Ambassador Linda Moore attempted to explain it to the Galactic Council. Jake continued. She termed it species-level deterrence. The concept that the cost of attacking humanity would be so catastrophic that no rational species would ever attempt it. Lisa looked up from her notes. How did the galaxy react? Terror, Jake said simply. Other species realized that humanity had transcended conventional warfare. We had engineered a system where our adversaries couldn't merely be defeated. They could be expunged from existence. Jake rose, beginning to pace again. Dr. Ellen Gray was studying alien psychology during the occupation. She discovered that other species were altering their behavior solely because of what humans had done to the Zephyrians. The reporter waited for him to continue. Trade routes were redesigned to circumvent human space, Jake stated. Not due to embargoes or sanctions, but because alien ship captains were afraid to approach our territory too closely. Military exercises were canceled if they occurred anywhere near human systems. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Lisa. Entire species began rewriting their military doctrine, not to fight humans, but to avoid ever giving humans a reason to fight them. Jake sat back down. The Andromedans developed what they called terror protocols, emergency plans for what to do if humanity ever declared war on them. Step 1. Immediate evacuation of all civilians. Step 2. Complete military surrender. Step 3. Pray that humans would accept surrender instead of total annihilation. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she wrote. Did these protocols prove effective? They were never put to the test, Jake replied. Because after what transpired with the Zephyrians, no species has ever been foolish enough to attack humanity again. The old soldier finished his drink and prepared to depart. The war officially concluded 14 months after its inception, but the true end arrived when the last Zephyrian military commander transmitted a message to Colonel Price. Lisa gathered her belongings swiftly. What did the message say? Jake paused at the cantina door. It wasn't a surrender. Surrenders can be revoked. It was an oath, a solemn pledge that no Zephyrian would ever again raise a weapon against a human being. Not just for now, forever. He looked back at her one last time. Colonel Price accepted the oath, but she also sent a response, a single sentence that every species in the galaxy has committed to memory by now. Lisa waited, sensing the gravity of this statement. We will be watching, Jake said. 3 words that irrevocably shifted the balance of power in the galaxy. Jake walked into the corridor, leaving Lisa alone with the terrible weight of what she had absorbed. Around her, the last few alien patrons finished their drinks and exited quickly. None desired to remain in a place where humanity's true nature had been so openly discussed. The young reporter sat alone, staring at her notes, wondering how much worse the story could still get. Tomorrow, she would learn of the final phase of the war, the part that made the galaxy whisper humanity's name in terror even 20 years later. Lisa Kane arrived at the Blue Moon Cantina for the final time. Jake Morrison was already there, seated at their usual table, but something was different today. The cantina was completely empty save for them. The alien patrons had entirely ceased their visits. "Last day," Jake said as she sat down. "Are you prepared to hear the conclusion of this narrative?" Lisa activated her recording device one final time. "I believe so, though I'm uncertain I truly wish to know." Jake nodded. 20 years have elapsed since the war's end. 20 years since the Zephyrian species learned to whisper when they speak of humans. Do you wish to comprehend what those 2 decades have been like? The old soldier gestured around the empty cantina. Observe this place. It once teemed with merchants from countless worlds. Now they avoid any station where humans might be present. That is our legacy. Lisa glanced at her notes from the preceding days. Tell me about the aftermath. What became of those who fought in the war? We returned home, Jake stated simply. Admiral Sullivan retired to a farm on New Kansas. General Cross took a position teaching military history. Colonel Price became a school administrator. We all attempted to resume normal lives. He paused, staring out the window at the empty docking bays. But normal was now a different concept. Earth had changed. Humanity had changed. We had learned something about ourselves that we couldn't unlearn. Jake rose and walked to the window. Captain Chris Bell now commands routine patrol missions. Nothing akin to the war fleets we once operated, but even his small vessel carries more fear than the largest alien battleship. Lisa appeared confused. What do you mean? Last month, Bell's ship encountered pirates assaulting a merchant convoy, Jake explained. 7 pirate vessels against 1 human patrol ship. The pirates should have held every advantage. The old soldier turned back to face her. But when the pirates recognized they were confronting a human ship, they surrendered immediately. Not a single shot fired. They didn't even attempt to flee. They simply ceased their actions and pleaded with Bell not to harm them. Jake resumed his seat. Bell later recounted that the pirate captain was weeping. A seasoned alien warrior, crying like a child because he believed he was about to face human warfare. Lisa was writing notes, but her hands were unsteady. What did Captain Bell do? He apprehended them, Jake said. Standard procedure, no violence necessary. But the pirates spent the entire journey to prison recounting to anyone who would listen their narrow escape from the terrible humans. The old soldier smiled, but it was a melancholy smile. That story disseminated through criminal networks within days. Now pirates avoid any shipping lane that might possess human protection, not because we patrol them more heavily, but simply because the possibility exists. Jake ordered a drink from the automated serving system. The cantina's alien staff had ceased appearing for work days ago. Dr. Ellen Gray now studies this phenomenon, he continued. She terms it reputation warfare. The notion that our reputation has become a weapon more potent than our actual ships and soldiers. Lisa looked up from her notes. Provide an example. The Centauri border conflict, Jake offered. 2 alien species warring over mining rights in a disputed system. The conflict had raged for 3 years. Thousands dead on both sides. Jake took a sip of his drink. Then someone proposed bringing in human mediators, not human soldiers, not human weapons, just human diplomats to assist with negotiations. The old soldier's voice softened. Both sides agreed to an immediate ceasefire within hours of that suggestion. Not because they desired human assistance, but because they were terrified of what might transpire if they refused humans. Lisa set down her pen. That's irrational. That is our current reality, Jake stated. Admiral Tony Clark, my former commander, now heads the Strategic Planning Division. He informed me that human involvement has prevented 17 distinct interstellar wars in the past decade. Jake rose and began pacing, not through military action, not through threats, but simply by existing. Other species are so apprehensive of triggering our total war doctrine that they resolve their disputes peacefully rather than risk human attention. The reporter found her voice. Is that beneficial or detrimental? Jake stopped pacing and looked at her with tired eyes. I no longer know. We achieve perfect deterrence. No species will ever again attack humanity. but the cost was transforming into something the galaxy fears more than death itself. He resumed his seat and finished his drink. There are human children now who don't comprehend why aliens regard them with such apprehension. Kids born after the war ended. They are growing up in a galaxy where their species' name is whispered like a malediction. Lisa looked around the empty cantina. What of the future? Will things ever revert to normal? Jake shook his head. Mrs. June Foster teaches at the primary school on New Earth. She has to explain to 6-year-old children why alien visitors sometimes flee upon seeing human faces. The old soldier's voice softened further. She tells them that long ago some bad aliens harmed human families, so human soldiers ensured those aliens could never hurt anyone again. She doesn't tell them how we achieved it. Jake rose to depart for the final time, but those children will mature knowing that their species is the most feared in the galaxy. They will carry that knowledge with them forever. Lisa gathered her notes and recording equipment. Where does this conclude, Commander? Will the galaxy ever cease to fear us? Jake paused at the cantina door. I attended a meeting last week with other retired officers. Admiral Clark was there. General Cross, Colonel Price, we were discussing this very question. He looked back at her, his eyes holding 20 years of regret. General Cross uttered something that remains with me. She said, "We won the war so completely that we lost something else. We lost the possibility of ever being perceived as anything other than monsters." Jake stepped into the corridor, then turned back one last time. You know the true tragedy? We are not monsters. We are simply humans who were pushed too far. But the galaxy will never discern the difference. Lisa watched him walk away down the empty corridor. Around her, the Blue Moon Cantina sat silent and abandoned. Outside the windows, alien ships altered course to avoid the station entirely. Humanity's reputation had permeated even this neutral ground. She looked down at her notes. Pages upon pages of testimony about a war that lasted only 18 months but changed the galaxy forever. The story of how humanity became so feared that their name was whispered in terror across 1,000 worlds. In her final report, Lisa Kane would write about the cost of perfect victory, about how a species could win so completely that they forfeited their place in the community of civilized worlds, about how fear once sown could grow until it consumed everything around it. But that night, alone in her quarters, Lisa Kane did something she had never done before. She locked her door twice and checked the window seals before going to sleep. Because she had learned something in those 5 days of interviews. She had learned why the galaxy whispered humanity's name in terror, and for the first time in her life she understood why they were right to be afraid.